We have converted to fresh mill flour, and I've either gotten recipes from people who did lots of experimenting converting a traditional recipe that used store-bought flour to fresh mill, or I have converted them myself. And one of my favorites that I've converted is a sweet cinnamon biscuit. It's different from a cinnamon roll. It does not have yeast. And I got my all-purpose mix idea from Cara, who does grains in small places. And the grains that I like to use are soft white wheat mixed with the hard white wheat mixed with the kamut. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to tar out my container. And on my sample here, I had 310 grams total, and I had 1 part hard white wheat, 1 part soft wheat, and 1 part kamut. I want the majority of this to be a soft white wheat. So I've got 171 grams of soft white wheat. I'm going to add about 100 grams, not the oxygen absorber, of the hard white. And I want to get to 310 total. And I'm going to add in some kamut. If you didn't have this and you wanted to use your milled berries, I would go with soft white wheat, the 310. And there we go. That's all the berries I'm going to need. I'm going to get this ground and we'll come back. I have milled my flour mix, and it is beautiful and soft. And every time I make this, I have different combination of my hard white wheat, soft white wheat, and kamut. I just kind of get a ballpark figure. And so use what you have. I'm a strong believer in, if you don't have it, use what you have. As far as using what you have, I have some whey here that I'm going to use for making the buttermilk. It calls for 3/4 cup. So I'm going to go just scant, add my buttermilk powder. It's what I use. If you have buttermilk, or if you just have regular milk, it's like 1 cup milk to 1 tablespoon of vinegar or lemon juice. Stir it up and let it sit for an hour, and you have buttermilk. I have this powder, which I really like. And it's about 3 tablespoons per cup. I'm a little short of a cup, so I'm going to add almost 3 of the buttermilk powder. And then I just stir it up. And I use the whey from, I make homemade yogurt. And I've used this in recipes. I made a gravy last week. I made a biscuit. Whatever liquid you have that you could use milk or water, you could substitute the whey. Some people pour it out. We save and reuse everything. My recipe also calls for a 1/4 cup of vegetable oil. I'm going to use a mix of this sweet cream butter infused oil from olive oil and a little bit of sunflower oil. You can use butter or canola oil, whatever you have. Into this will be 1 cup. I'm just going to add it to this. A neat tool I want to show is this cool tool from olive oil. This here is designed to pour slow. If you want fast pouring, you just pop this off and you've got a little faster pour, and then you put it back in. I love this tool. I use this for making fresh milled bread, and the olive oil, I add this because I don't want it as strong of olive oil. So I just add a slosh of this. Again, use what you have. I'm going to mix my flour with the olive oil and buttermilk and let it sit while I talk about the other ingredients or gather the other ingredients. And the reason why they call this sometimes an autolease, what it does is because this is fresh milled, it has the bran in it, which can sometimes be sharp and inhibit some growth. So they call an autolease, which just softens your bran a little bit, a wee bit. And this is something that I do. You don't have to. I just mix this, stir this, and I'm going to let this sit. My dough looks about so. Typically the rule is when you're using a soft white wheat, you add an extra 1/4 cup of wheat berries. If you're using a hard white, you decrease by 1/4 cup. I'm using both, so I'm going to let this sit and we'll talk about the other ingredients and then we'll come back to mixing the rest of that. The other ingredients I'm going to add into the flour mix is going to be 1 tablespoon of baking powder, 1 teaspoon of salt, and a 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda. And typically I don't add this until a little bit closer to when I'm going to use it because this will activate it in place of the yeast. I have some homemade butter, which is 83 grams. And the recipe calls for 8 tablespoons. I find that way too much. So I go with about 5 to 6 tablespoons of butter. And how I made it, I put it in my Bosch mixer and I turned it on till it got to the whipping cream stage. And then I let it go past that. And then I got this beautiful butter and I rinsed it under cold water. It doesn't stick like store-bought flour or butter, or as this will stick when I go to roll it out. When I go to roll it out, I'm going to be using some Ceylon Cinnamon and I'm going to use some Sucanat. I do have a couple of varieties of Sucanat. I have one that's very fine and I have one that's not so fine. And I'm going to use this one because I have some of this open. You could use brown sugar. If you don't have brown sugar, you could use white sugar. If you want to make brown sugar and you have cane sugar and molasses, you take a cup of cane sugar to a teaspoon of molasses and you mix that together and you get brown sugar. With the recipe, it does call for 8 tablespoons of butter. When I'm using this homemade butter, it's about 5 to 6 tablespoons. I also use it to butter the dish, and I also save a tablespoon that I mixed with some vanilla and powdered sugar for the glaze afterwards. So to put in the rest of my ingredients, it calls for 1 teaspoon of salt, calls for a 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda because I don't want any chunks, and 1 tablespoon of baking powder. And it does say that you can knead this slightly, which is what I'm going to do to knead all of this ingredients in. I'm going to take this homemade butter and I'm just going to put a little on my baking dish, and I'm using a round baking dish and my goal is to get 9 cinnamon rolls. I've made them with 8, but I want to get 9. So maybe I used a 1/2 teaspoon of butter, not very much. So I'll save that. This is how much butter I have left. I added this and now I'm going to just gently knead this in and then we'll get it rolled out and make sure we get the oven started. I have made it where I've added it in with the flour and it turned out just fine. So I'm still kind of experimenting with this. So I'm just going to knead it a little bit. It does have oil in it, so it doesn't stick. And then I'm going to let this sit for a few minutes while I turn on the oven. I can tell right now that there's a lot of gluten structure. It's not going to roll very good. But I feel like I got the stuff mixed in there fairly good. While it calls for 8 tablespoons of butter, I think that's too much. I'm going to save this tablespoon for when I make the glaze. And with the rest of this, I'm just going to spread this out using my fingers. And I'm going to get this evenly spread out. And then we'll come back for the Sucanat and the cinnamon. I think I got this spread out pretty good. As long as I've got even amount of butter kind of spread across, it'll be just fine. The Sucanat, and I think this here is a bit too much, but it is a treat. It's not like you have it every day. Or your brown sugar, whichever you'd prefer. I'm just going to spread this about. Use my hand to spread it evenly. And I'm trying not to get this edge with too much, because that's the edge I'm going to use to adhere it once I roll it up. It calls for a teaspoon of cinnamon, and I put it in this, and I'm not exact to the amount of cinnamon. It might be a little over. And then again, same thing, as I try to get an even roll going down, and if I feel I need a little more, I'll add a little more. And I want to add a little more. So I'm going to add a generous amount because we like cinnamon. This is Ceylon cinnamon, so it's a little bit lightly flavored. Oh, my oven's ready. If you have a little Vietnamese cinnamon, that's a little stronger flavor. To roll this up, this is where I use a bench knife just to loosen it a little bit. It's okay if it sticks, it's not going to tear. And then I'm just going to tightly roll this up as best as I can. And again, we're making biscuits similar to cinnamon rolls, but not with yeast. This is with a baking powder. I know you could make it with sourdough, but this is not the recipe I'm showing today. And I just kind of fuss with it a little bit because I want to make sure it's tight. You can especially feel it loose on the ends where some of the Sucanat or your brown sugar will fall through, but I kind of squish that up a little bit. And this is what I was referring to when I get to the end of wanting to lift this. And I apologize if I got my arm in the way, to adhere it to the roll. And if you've got a lot of butter on it, doesn't want to adhere as well. So there is my roll. And then I kind of square it up a little bit, squishing in the ends. And then I mark it. I know I can get 8, but I really want to get 9. I've done this with a dental floss, a bench knife, a sharp knife, and it doesn't seem to really make that much of a difference unless you don't want to scratch your counter. And then I put it in my bowl and press it down ever so slightly. And I'm cutting this a little shorter than my marks because I want to try and get 9 out, and this one on the end. And then I just kind of squish it down a little bit so they're all fairly level. I know this one's a big one. And then with the leftover brown sugar or your Sucanat or your white sugar, whichever you've chosen to use, I just sprinkle the rest of it on here. Any of the butter that melts out kind of almost makes a delicious decadent butter glaze. Put this in the oven for 400 degrees, and I'm going to check it in about 15 minutes. Typically it takes about 22 minutes in my oven, and we'll be back. I've had this vinegar going for several years, and I've got bags to start some more. I don't know what I'm waiting for. I have bourbon and vodka to do an experiment, but I do like to add a slosh of this into the frosting because I have it. If you don't have it, you don't have to. It's just what I do. I have this ready for when it comes out. I've got my about tablespoon, more like 3/4 tablespoon of butter. I've got some vanilla, and I have some powdered sugar. I'll use about a cup of this powdered sugar, and I'll whip up the glaze and I'll spread it on while it's still warm. These are fresh out of the oven. They're quite hot. It's still bubbling over there, and the brown is not burnt. And these were about, as usual, 22 minutes. I'm going to let these cool down a bit, and we'll whip up the glaze and put that on. Because I make my own vanilla, I'm a little more frivolous, so I'm adding a teaspoon of vanilla. Typically, you'd only add a drop or two, but because I have it, I'm going to use it. With the butter in the bowl, you can put this on the stove while this is baking. I put this in the microwave because I forgot to do that. And then I add a smidge of milk. If you add too much, you just add a little more powdered sugar. If you didn't add enough, you add a little more milk. And I'm just going to get this stirred up. Typically, if these are warm, you don't need to get this as runny because the warmth soaks it through. So this is a little bit more runny than I like it. So I'm just going to spread this about, and I'm going to use it up. And I always save the bowl for the first serving of biscuits. That's one I have. And I'm not a big sugar eater. If you're not a big sugar eater, there are recipes you could do with garlic or other seasonings to make it more savory. This is something my family likes, so I'm going to make it the way I've always made it. And I tasted it to see if I needed a little more butter or vanilla, and I don't. The cinnamon in the biscuits really is the star of the show. So I'm going to let this cool down about 15 minutes and then have one and show you what the inside looks like. This is the cinnamon biscuit. It's soft, it's delicious, it's got lots of butter and sugar, and I don't want a whole one. But this is the biscuit, and it's absolutely delicious. So good. Who knew healthy eating would be so tasty?